He's great Minnesota mayor. You're on your side. It's a big deal. We got Aurora and Fergus Falls here.
I tried.
I wish you would. I said they keep me off social media.
I tried to read I tried. How are you?
Good, how are you?
No, that was someone else, but it was hilarious.
I'm getting some of these that are feeding through it.
Yeah.
It's great. Hi, Mayor. Good to see you.
Going good.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, no, that's big stuff.
Thank you for the
A lot of
pension bill,
non-public.
everyone.
Takes a lot of that unfunded liability off the bottom line.
No, we really appreciate your work on that. He's our lead-off batter.
Nice.
It hasn't lined up. You have the order. Introduce one. No, it was. This is working.
Oh, yeah, the unseen box.
Longer drive.
Senator, and then the mayor, Mayor Chris Walz, and then it'll be Jamie, and then it'll be you, and then Peggy, and then it'll be
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's the basic Republican things. Government is growing. It's too big. It's, you know what I'm saying? You know, these cities need to work together. This shit, yeah, exactly. Is your mic cord already plugged in?
Well, he was right. Nice.
Yeah, so then it's gonna be
You were looking very skeptical. Good reporter was. Supposed to leave at 9, but they said she's somewhere around there. Making Greg Lyle.
Okay.
I wouldn't have told her that. Yeah.
Senator, good to see you.
It's
It's a big state.
big, wide, boring roads. I guess it's be careful, but yeah.
It's been
A lot of towns out
lots of snacks in the car. It's good. Yesterday we went to the Pursuit community and met with the tribal council there, and they were like, no one's ever called us to meet, so we didn't really know what to do. Like, let's talk about it.
Yeah, we've talked about that program too. I don't think that people that have organized are not real successful. I think some of it is
Yes, we will. There's an opportunity.
Thanks everybody for taking time to come. Appreciate it. Wasn't a slow news day.
Slow news day, right? Yeah.
This has been great. It's unbelievable.
Senators, you ready? Yeah. All right, let's go. School teacher in me. The bell rang.
Got it. Good morning. My name is Jeff Hayden. I'm the state senator from Senate District 62, JEFFHAYDEN, for those of you who don't know me. I represent the heart of South Minneapolis, and I'm proud to be a supporter of Tim and Peggy. The reason for us being here is really to take a good look and to talk about LGA and its effects on cities throughout the state. We know that Minneapolis and St. Paul in particular, we hear a lot about them being the greatest benefactors, but I think you're going to hear from the folks that are here today that LGA is important throughout the state. I also want to make a notion that Governor Pawlenty cut LGA when he was governor. I was here. It was painful, and it was painful for cities and townships throughout the state. And we really don't want to go backwards we don't want to go backwards in the state. The vital services that LGA provides, police, fire, first responders, really make sense for our state, and it keeps our state in a much better place. Tim and Peggy clearly have built a broad coalition from across the state who understand this issue, and I'm just one of them that is very proud to stand with them, to hear their vision and to help in any way that I can to make sure that our state doesn't go backwards and that we can elect really smart, progressive leaders across this state. And I say that in a way that moves us forward. That's what I mean when I say progressive. It doesn't take us backwards. So with that being said, I want to introduce Mayor Shire.
That's right.
Hey, Mayor. Thank you. And I'm Ben Shire, Mayor of Fergus Falls, and I'm here with the Mayor of Aurora. So, you know, in Minnesota, we're very fortunate to have a rich tradition of strong leaders with the values, the vision, and the passion that lift everyone up. And that's why across the nation, they look at Minnesota as a state that works. And Tim and Peggy are those leaders. They're leaders who believe in policies that work for all Minnesotans. They're leaders who believe they don't buy into the rural-urban divides, or they don't buy into the metro, I'd say, differences, but they believe in one Minnesota. And a Minnesota where everyone has value and everyone's voice is heard. As an outstate mayor, I can tell you we have got to get back to working together across this state. We've got to get back to the values that build this state. Minnesota was founded on rural-urban coalitions working together. And our best policies have come when we work together as one Minnesota. 45 years ago, when Governor Wendy Anderson brought together a group of bipartisan legislators from across the state to create the Minnesota Miracle, it was a time when government worked in Minnesota for all Minnesotans. It's when leaders stood up to say that all children deserve quality education regardless of the wealth of district. And for a strong Minnesota, we need all of our communities to be viable places to live, raise a family, and start a business. You know, too often today, the critics of those policies point to local government aid as a regional or a political issue. It's not a regional or political issue, it's a Minnesota issue. Adequate police and fire protection, safe roads and bridges, clean parks, those are not Democrat or Republican values. Those are not outstate or metro values. Those are Minnesota values. And as mayors, we understand the difficulty in balancing providing growth and livable cities with being responsible to our taxpayers. Yes, we have to be concerned about the next property tax statement, but we also have to be concerned about the next generation. In Fergus Falls, local government aid means we don't have to choose between public safety and public parks. It means we can provide a full staff of police department of 23 officers, but still maintain 116 miles of roads and bridges and 40 acres of public parks. Friends, today more than ever is a time when we need leaders who believe in policies that bring us together, not divide us. Yeah. Who believe that the state works best when we all work together. Tim and Peggy believe in one Minnesota, and I'm going to stand with them. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just add, and I concur with everything that Ben said, but in politics, you know, people don't care what you know until they know you care. When you talk to the congressman and you talk to Peggy, you know they care. And every voice matters in Minnesota, and we do need to come together in unity. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Jamie Becker-Finn. I'm the state representative for District 42B. And one of the things I like about LGA is that it follows a formula. And that means that we're more likely to have fair results based on the needs of individual cities. And unlike many things at the Capitol, like the bonding bill, it doesn't matter whether your city or your township is currently represented by a Republican or a Democrat. What matters is, you know, it's based on actual factual information that we know, and that keeps it fair. It's not based on whether you can afford an expensive lobbyist. It's based on need. And the reality is that across Minnesota, our cities have the same needs: safe neighborhoods, drivable roads, housing, services that make communities great places to live. So I grew up in rural northern Minnesota, the city of Cass Lake, and when I was growing up, the population was around 1,000, but it's dropped over the years. And in fact, in the 1950s, the city of Cass Lake had over 3,000 people, and it's now dropped to under 1,000. And when I was growing up, Cass Lake had a police department. And in 2008, after years of a declining population, and in order to stay within their budget, Cass Lake had to abolish their police department. This wasn't based on a decline in the crime. It wasn't based on the police not being necessary. It was a purely financial decision. And if we're serious about taking care of each other in this state, things like that shouldn't happen, and LGA is part of making sure things like that don't happen. I currently represent 5 different suburban cities in Ramsey County: Venice Heights, Little Canada, Roseville, Shoreview, and Gem Lake. And each of these cities is unique in its population, housing stock, and property tax base. Historically, 2 of my cities have received no LGA, 2 of the cities have received some LGA, and 1 of my cities really does depend on LGA. And that's because the need is there based on the unique characteristics of that city. Little Canada has about the same population of Waseca or Grand Rapids, and in some ways has a lot more in common with cities like that in rural Minnesota than it does with Minneapolis or St. Paul. Rural, urban, suburban, the reality is that we're not all that different, and when it comes down to it, all of our cities have the same needs. As a northern Minnesota girl, I still refer to the Twin Cities metro area as the cities. And I remember growing up and going on vacation once and staying in a hotel in St. Paul, the one with the ducks in the courtyard. And I had this idea that the metro area was so fancy because it had all these restaurants and big buildings and ducks and hotels. And but now I work as an assistant Hennepin County attorney. And I've spent the last several years working at the Domestic Abuse Service Center at the Government Center in downtown Minneapolis. And I talk to my colleagues who work in child protection and the police officers who work on the streets. And Minneapolis and St. Paul don't seem quite so fancy anymore. I'm not saying that those places are bad places to live or work at all. It's just that the reality is that the realities of poverty and the need for services in just that one city are clear to me every day. Poverty doesn't care how many people live within the city limits, and poverty doesn't care which congressional district you live in. I was really heartened to be asked to speak today. It's critically important that we talk about programs like LGA in making sure that every Minnesotan has access to the services that they need and that all of our cities can really thrive. It may not be a fancy topic to talk about, but it is so needed across our state. And by making this commitment today to LGA, Tim and Peggy are making a commitment to every community and every resident of Minnesota that we should all be supported and have access to the services that we all need. And now I am pleased to introduce Senator Fongher.
My name is Fongher, State Senator for Eastside St. Paul, and I'm glad to be here. And it's right that I be here to support the initiative of Tim Walz and Peggy Finnegan on their LGA initiative. I want to express how important it is for our Minnesota state government to support the local government. I wasn't here prior to 2012 when the LGA was cut back, and I'm glad that after 2012, when I served in the Senate, we were able to increase and restore to some degree from 2012 to 2013. And we have seen that growth. And you know, we also know that there's a correlation between property tax levy and also, you know, LGA. You know, and if we just continue to increase property tax, we will displace communities. People can't afford to stay where they stay anymore, and you know, they may be going to some place or sell their home, or you know, not feeling good where they are living. So I'm glad that, you know, Walz and Flanagan wanting to take this initiative, and I'm with them all the way. And so communities need to be funded, and enough with tax break for the wealthy and for the corporates, and we need local infrastructure funding, and I believe Governor Tim Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan will keep on making the case for LGA increase in the coming years. So thank you for allowing me to say in support of this. And next, I would like to invite our future Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan.
Good morning. I know that it is not a slow news day today, so we are appreciative of folks being here. I'm really honored and humbled to be standing here with leaders from all across the state. And I think that speaks to the work that Congressman Walz and myself have been doing together in partnership over the last 8 months, which is to unite Minnesota, to bring folks together across the urban and rural communities, and looking at and focusing on issues like LGA are just one of the ways to make sure that we're achieving that unity and equity in our state. It is also clear to me that there's a true need to build relationships and connection and understanding with folks all across the state. And from the folks behind me that you can see, we're doing just that. Making sure that folks have the resources that they need in their communities. As we've been traveling across the state of Minnesota, putting many miles on our vehicle, which I hope our good work is offsetting our carbon footprint as we travel across the state, is hearing from folks regardless of where they are. People want to ensure that they live in safe communities, that they have opportunities for their families to thrive, and that they really feel like they can put down roots and have a home there and not have to choose what area of the state they live in, that they can simply make their home and a community there. So that's why you know, we're here together standing with these leaders, and knowing that it's going to take everybody in this state to work across party lines, to work across communities, to ensure that people have what they need. So I am just thrilled to be here, and this is the most exciting thing that I get to do as part of this gig as Lieutenant Governor, candidate for Lieutenant Governor, which is to introduce you to the next governor of the state of Minnesota, Congressman Tim Walz.
Well, thank you all for being here. Peggy's right. I know you're all busy. It turned out to be a pretty busy news day. We're certainly grateful to the leaders here, especially in the House and Senate, who got us a pension bill and got it to the governor. Of course, disappointed again where the failure to be able to come together to serve the Minnesota citizens that we all represent. And I too, like Peggy, am proud to stand with this group, not just because they're supporting us in a race. It's because they're the people that are building Minnesota. We have folks here from the Iron Range to Lake Country to southern Minnesota. We have urban and suburban legislators all focused on the idea that Minnesota can work, and when it works together, we solve problems. That, to me, is what this was all about. And this issue of local government aid, when I went to Congress, I was very clear about this. Someone asked me the first time, they said, "You've never run for anything in your life. Why run for Congress? Why wouldn't you run for like city councilor or mayor?" And I said, "Do you know how hard those jobs are? And they know where you live." And the issue that I knew was, my job was to be a deputy. county commissioner, a deputy mayor, to the folks that were out there delivering that and forming this partnership and listening to the experts and bringing that knowledge here to advocate. This job is not a platform for our ideology. This job is a platform to unite Minnesota about common goals and policies that make a difference. And that's what the issue of LGA is about, that you cannot go anywhere in Minnesota to not understand how important this is, because this is one of those things that separates Minnesota from other states, that it fixes this issue of inequities in property taxes. It ensures that the basic delivery of services are in every single community. When you hear a mayor talk about fire departments or police forces or basic infrastructure in those communities, those are things that all Minnesotans should expect to have happen, and with good leadership and adequate consistent funding to that through LGA, they're doing it. These are thriving communities. They're making it. But we saw what happened during Tim Pauline's years when they cut LGA. We saw what happened to these communities, and we saw rural and urban Minnesota start to get this idea that there was being a playbook that they were going to divide us around that. Well, we're here today to make a pretty clear statement on things. When Peggy and I are in governor, we will restore LGA funding, and we will increase its funding to match inflation every single year to give these leaders the consistency they need. And I think what you're seeing is and with Peggy and myself, and with this group of leaders who are up here, these great leaders, this is about modeling how government should work. This is about modeling how communities should work. This is about partnerships together. We didn't make an announcement on the eve of a convention about who's going to be Lieutenant Governor again, because there were too many conversations to have. There were too many life experiences that Peggy Flanagan had and expertise that brought that I did not have, that needed to be incorporated into how do we build these coalitions. And whether it's the senator from St. Paul or whether it's a mayor from the Iron Range, those are ideas that come together, and those who want to tell you this state is divided, or those who choose to run a campaign to divide the state, will find out very quickly that is not where Minnesota's heart is at. So I am grateful to be with folks. We're grateful to build a one Minnesota that works for all of us, and hopeful for the future. And this LGA piece is one concrete step that will give the consistent funding, will give the certainty to communities going forward so that they can implement their hopes and dreams for Minnesota and communities that work for all of them. So I thank you for that. And before I take questions, I'm going to anticipate that first one. I know you just came from a press conference where Tim Pauline announced his running mate, which I was a little confused about because I thought he had announced his running mate in Donald Trump long ago when he started his campaign. It was pretty clear the direction this was going to go. He picked, I think, a consistency in Senator Fischbach. During her time in the Senate, cutting about 19% from the University of Minnesota, making it clear that education wasn't a priority. The contrast could not be greater. We welcome her to the race. We welcome the ability to make a contrast. We believe, this group believes, that the message for Minnesota is a hopeful, joyous one Minnesota, where we work together to solve problems. We reject the notion of false scarcity. So those who ask, how are you going to do LGA funding? Well, one thing we're not going to do is give tax breaks to premium cigar companies. That will be a first start that will then go to Aurora or go to Fergus Falls. And those are the types of things that I think Minnesotans want to hear. So I thank you all for being here, and we'd be glad to take any questions.
On that subject, explain a little more about how you would get money for LGA increases. One of the things you might want to do, you would increase taxes.
Well, Peggy and I, what we'd say on this, again, I start with that false scarcity piece on this. I trust the legislative process. I come from the legislative branch that sees co-equal branches. Our job is to set the vision, to make the case of where we're going to go, and then work with legislators to try and find that. We are not afraid to say when there's times to need revenue that we will talk about that. We've talked about it before on transportation funding. Governor Pauline, a year after the bridge fell, had to fight his own legislature, his own Republican legislators, to override the veto of well-needed funding because we had a gas tax increase. So we look at all forms of doing this. We think there's restructuring that we can do in government to get more efficiencies out of it. But the one thing we're not going to tell people is we're not going to talk about fees, and we're not going to talk about gimmicks. We're going to talk about if it takes funding on this, we'll go to Minnesota taxpayers, ask them, and show a budget that makes sense to them that they wrote together. So we will not shy away from talking about whether it be reforms, whether it be cutting back from tax breaks that were given to special interest, or whether it be talking to Minnesotans about what are their interests, what are they getting for this.
So you don't have an answer to how you fund it today?
it should not be our answer to do this. Our job is to work together, because I think the problem we have in government right now is before we go back and have these conversations, before we work with local mayors, before we know what the need is and do the assessments and come up with what we need to do to make sure that we match those fundings that they need and work with the legislators as we prioritize everything, I think that's where we go awry. So we are certainly open to working together. We certainly are going to do a budgeting a little different. There's not going to be any surprises with people, because the people impacted by those budgets are going to be working with us before we even release one. And I think that's a little bit different than we've seen in the past, and I think it fits our philosophy of everybody who's going to be impacted by these have a seat at the table.
Congressman, what's your delegate count going into the convention by your estimates? That's the key number.
Well, we're DFLers, so yes, we're confident going in. We're cautiously confident. We have worked hard. We've taken this process seriously. We've built a strong coalition of folks who are out there. We think we have the potential to go into the convention with a first vote delegate count that is higher than any we've seen in decades. And I think with that being the case, the momentum is there. And we feel very confident that the DFL understands that uniting Minnesota, that bringing a team that brings strength in all corners of the state, a team that has the resources to win, and a team that is obviously being noticed by the Polini campaign, because that's all they attack, is us. We take heart in that they've probably seen the same polls we've seen. So.
You want to obviously bring Democrats together, but you're going to have to compare, and when you're out there on the floor, you're going to be comparing and contrasting yourself to Rebecca Otto and to Aaron Murphy. And what kind of argument are you going to be making to delegates? If either or both of you answer.
Yeah.
Sure. So one of the things, and you said this earlier, we've been doing this together for 8 months. So we've been building this coalition. We joke sometimes about, so we're 8 months in. Either we thought that we would be at each other's throats, or we'd be closer. We are certainly closer and really partners in this, which is really important. We have a lot of fun. But I would say this, the difference that I think you see is that I think we have a ticket that really looks like Minnesota. And I think that people see themselves reflected in our ticket, based on even the folks who are standing here with us today, and I think that really matters. Listen, we just got done with a really interesting legislative session, and I use interesting in the way that we use it as Minnesotans, to say that we didn't make a whole lot of progress. And we have to get real when we talk about a big, bold, progressive vision for the state of Minnesota. That what we also need to ensure is that we win back legislative seats with folks who share our values of bringing that state together and bringing our state together across this vision of investing in communities. And until we do that, and I think that we are the ticket that's going to be able to unite Minnesota, to win back those House seats so that we can move this agenda instead of the governor, who's been doing a great job, Governor Dayton, of being, that goalie, but that we can start to finally set that agenda in partnership with a legislature that shares our values and wants to get it done.
I'm a football coach. I want to score touchdowns. I don't want to play goalie. So we're going on the offense.
You mind elaborating as well, just like your running mate did, when you're out there on the floor, you're going to compare and contrast, you're going to say, why?
Yeah, well, I think it's certainly winning. I'm the last of the rural progressives in America, of anybody in the Congress. I think I have a record that stands firm. I also have a record of effectiveness that brings people together. That's the argument. If there's a contrast against it, I got the other day, someone said our critique of you is you talk too much about being a bridge builder. I'll make the case on that bridge building has got effective policy done, whether it be overturning Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or whether it be getting adequate funding for rural renewable energy into the Farm Bill. Those are the types of things that I have a pretty broad understanding of and pretty broad coalition. So we're making the case on the floor. We can win. We can win in all corners of Minnesota. We know what the game plan is. The game plan looks pretty much like the electoral map of 2016 for Republicans. Lose the Twin Cities, do okay in the suburbs, and decimate everybody in greater Minnesota. That is not the game plan that will work with us. That is not one that will allow them to peel us off, because I think there's a proven track record of that. And I think we go back to this, of people making the case. I won Minneapolis and St. Paul, Peggy and I did, on the straw poll with Democrats when we had 30 or 40,000 Democrats out voting. That was a pretty strong statement that we played pretty well in the urban area too.
Let me comment, excuse me. Let's presume or assume that you get the endorsement this weekend. You mentioned
say on this, there's not gonna be a whole lot of difference, because again, who claims Donald Trump as their running mate, will be interesting, because both do, obviously. I think it's clear to us that Tim Pawlenty certainly is going to have a lot of money, a lot of outside money at this point in time. There's 400 really dedicated people in Maplesport who want to see him be governor of Minnesota. So we don't take that lightly, and I say this non-facetiously, that someone with that kind of money and that kind of name-ranking issue is probably going to stride very big into that space. We welcome that, I think, and we're very clearly talking about Tim Pawlenty, because his agenda is very clear to understand. What he's done, his record is very clear to understand. And his vision for Minnesota, divided Minnesota, coming at the least fortunate of us, coming at people who don't have health insurance, coming at new Americans, that is going to be the same message Jeff Johnson delivers. But at this point in time, I would think the Republicans will go where the money's at. They will go with the person that they know. And for us, that is a wonderful place to make a contrast, because Tim Pawlenty sees the world in Minnesota through a very different lens than I see. I see one through a joyful hopefulness of uniting us. He sees it through an electoral map that divides us off and tells us that we're not all in this together. So that's kind of where our focus.
Congressman, are you disappointed that faith in Minnesota has thrown its weight toward Aaron Murphy?
Well, I think I'm a little disappointed, but I think part of it is this is a learning process that I've got out, and I continue to, I think, grow as a person and grow as a candidate. This is a group of folks with a very clear agenda coming together, one that I share much of their vision of a united Minnesota. I think a narrative, because I am the last of a species, a rural Democrat, there's an assumption of what a rural Democrat, because there's 10 of us in the United States Congress left out of 435 that are represent rural farming areas. I represent now, because of Connor Lamb, the most Republican district. So I think there was a narrative of a lot of folks that didn't get a chance to meet us. I think you saw at the end of that process, there was kind of an awakening if they saw what a partnership looked like, what kind of co-governing with communities looked like. And those are folks that understand and are pragmatic too. They've made very clear they'll go with who's winning. They'll go with who's leading. They want to build a partnership with the next governor, not with just someone who ideologically agrees with them. And I think in the DFL, there's a real strong feeling about this. We've got to be very clear. There are 3 great candidates running. These are friends of mine. These are progressive people who made a difference and led. We were under no illusion. I mean, with the exception of Bruce, it's pretty hard for a rural outstater, because everybody talks about uniting the state, but 95% of the events I've done and the debates I've been in are always in the Twin Cities. I'm the guy driving from Mankato every time. Dave's the guy driving in from Aurora today. Ben's the guy driving in from Fergus Falls. And so I think that group didn't get a chance to really know that. They had some preconceived notions, but I feel comfortable in it that we'll do well. And again, I certainly thank that group. There was a real sense of trying to understand who I was as a candidate, and how I conveyed that to people.
Sure. And I think the Faith in Minnesota delegation created a really important space and conversation, which is one where Democrats can actually talk about their faith. I think it's critically important for us to be able to make that connection and talk about it. So, as a person of faith myself, who is guided by Matthew 25, as we talk about the least of these, we were able to have that conversation in partnership with folks. And I am eager to continue these conversations, these relationships that we have with the Faith in Minnesota delegation. And I think they've really signaled that they are engaged, they are nimble, and frankly, the things that we have talked about on this campaign trail the whole time, which is making sure that the people who are most impacted by decisions have a seat at the table, that falls right in line with many of their values. So we look forward to continuing these conversations and think that we'll be working together at the end of the convention.
Anyone else, final thoughts? Well, thank you all for being here. We're grateful.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you. It's been an honor. Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, no, thank you.
Ready for the great secret. Great secret. Ready for the great
All right.
Can we get on with the mayor?
Get you guys in the middle. Yeah, get it in there. Get you guys in the middle.
Ready? 1, 2, 3. I'm gonna take a few. Step closer. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh, you all look awesome. Yay!
Question I'm gonna ask is the urban delegates, they need to tell me they've been in Aurora, they've been in Fergus Falls, so they know this. Thank you, Senator.
Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. I'm gonna take a step closer. 1, 2, 3.
Your video is beautiful. Be up on the screen.
Hi, Spencer.
Thank you, thank you.
You folks should be there for the convention tomorrow night.
We are. My 11-year-old's just excited out of his skin. He thinks it's like a Super Bowl type of situation.
Oh, but you see, you'll be disappointed.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, it's cool. We'll see you there.
Yeah, I don't know how they're gonna have it set up. Usually we're on one side of the podium or the other.
Yeah, and I think the pilot was like next to. Yeah.
So we can listen in.
Yeah, that's right. That couple of
Well, we'll probably see you tomorrow night.
sounds good.
I said this.
Yeah,
When I
right.
started running,
Exactly.
I said I wasn't gonna fall back. I'm always, so I don't go for another one on that, so. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Our stuff.
Sarah.
Hi. Yes. Yes, that sounds good. Good.
Yeah.